Hi everyone, today I'm here with Scott Abbott Paterson, who is a lecturer at the University of Bristol. Scott, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Scott Abbott Paterson. I use he, him pronouns. I am an anatomist, senior lecturer, and school education director at the University of Bristol in the School of Anatomy. I'm also the co-founder of the Anatomy Collective for Equality. Nearly forgot that, and that's a really important one to remember. It's an organisation that works within the anatomy community to promote inclusivity and equality within the discipline area.
And we'll be talking a little bit more about that later. So could you tell me a little bit more about your wider work with sex and gender inclusivity in anatomical education?
Of course. For me, I think it all really started or was inspired by my undergraduate studies in forensic anthropology and anatomy at the University of Dundee. Anatomy often gets thought of as being quite anonymous. We tend to be thinking about specimens and donors rather than necessarily thinking about identities. But for forensic anthropology, the conversation really is about centering the identity of the individual. And, from a forensic anthropology perspective, it's looking at human remains and working out who that individual was. And so we spent a lot of time considering the complex ways that our individuality manifests in our bodies and how our anatomy and our sense of self interplay. And that, I think, has always really captured me and held my fascination. I think that's a bias, I suppose, that I bring to a lot of my anatomy practice. And it's something that I've always tried to kind of acknowledge as a subject specialist. In the DR dissection room, we'll often talk about things like the external os of the cervix and use that as an indicator of someone's personal history. Quite often frames itself in conversation with people saying, "Oh, this means this individual was a mother," or "This means this individual had children." And I always think that's a really nice opportunity to start discussing the concept of identity. And because someone biologically carried a child to term and passed that child through their cervix, what does that actually mean in terms of motherhood and in terms of that person's identity? And so that's a nice opportunity to can start having those conversations. In terms of expansive consideration of sex and gender, it kind of followed after that with a program that I lead, an intercalating program that I lead. And I noticed that students were often using the term sex and gender interchangeably. And from my forensic background, we'd had sort of training on that wasn't always, that wasn't necessarily the case, that the two were not inextricably linked. They were very closely related and hard to disentangle, but that they were not strictly speaking the same thing. And that led me to then start a bit more of a sort of formal exploration of sex and gender within my anatomy teaching practice.
That's great, thank you. I think even I have been doing more research recently with anatomy and what we're doing, and it's only been kind of now that I've started to properly understand the difference between sex and gender, because I don't think oftentimes we don't have a very good or robust explanation of it in our medical curriculum. And I think, like you said, people use it interchangeably. It's the same with like race and ethnicity get used interchangeably. And those, even I still struggle to kind of detangle both of them from each other because, for example, on the census, we use ethnicity, not race. So when we're having those conversations, it sounds like if you want to set the definitions of what we're talking about and what it actually means. And I think that gives students a better understanding of it, definitely, because being biologically female and being a woman or identifying as a woman can be two different things. So, and that can lead to two different, coming at from a medical point of view, different health conditions, different everything. So it's really important to be able to distinguish between the two, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that point about defining is really important. And it's something we talk a lot about our students, if they're writing an essay or if they're writing an argumentative piece, define your parameters, define your argument. And I think it's really important that we stop to think about any minoritized group or minoritized characteristic that we are assuming everyone has the same definition for, and really consider where any of those definitions have a biological basis. And I think that's broadly the assumption that we take to anatomy as a subject and to medicine more broadly. But I think it's really important that we stop to consider where social influence and those kind of socially constructed groupings have sort of been built into the system as well, because a lot of those assumptions are there, but a lot of the discourse is focused from a biological perspective, not from that more sort of social, philosophical perspective. And that yeah, as I say, that's something I've tried to build a little bit more time for in our consideration of some of these important criteria.
Yeah, I think it's definitely really interesting, kind of looking at things from a more sex-based perspective rather than gender-based teaching, because like I said, gender is fluid, so many different ways that people can present their gender and can identify. And like you said, it's interesting to talk about how someone's sex might relate to their gender identity as well, and how those things and how their anatomy relates to their gender identity. But unfortunately, I didn't, when I was doing my cadaveric dissection, we didn't really have any diversity in kind of gender identity. It is very cisgender male, cisgender female presentations. I'm not sure, have you noticed anything different in Bristol with your, if you do cadaveric dissection?
Yes, so across the various groups we teach, we have a combination of cadaveric dissection, prosection based teaching. I think it's interesting the point you made about gender and its fluidity. And it's one of the things I really love about discussing gender is that if we think about the entirety of human history, and if we think about the sort of the true global perspective and how that changes, anything you say about gender will be contradicted at some point in that history and at some point in the geography. That's what's so amazing about gender. And I think that's where the point about it kind of being this social construct is that, and so what I mean by that is that society and humanity's value of sex, if we like, is typically what we mean by gender. And so there is that influence that, as I say, is complex, and disentangling it is really difficult. In terms of specifically our donors, I think, our donors are incredible people, and to give the gift of your body for medical education, for anatomy teaching and dissection is admirable. And of course, we're always very grateful to anyone who does donate their body. There are limitations that come with that in terms of diversity, because in certain regions of the world we might get particular propensity for particular categories, particular gender identities, particular racial diversity and ethnic diversity, disability, all of these kind of frequently minoritized identity traits that are difficult to account for. And of course, diversity is so complex that you could have 5 donors that all have matching criteria in some areas that we do record, but have diversity in others. So what I would say is that while we maybe don't necessarily have a room of donors that looks hugely diverse on first impression, I think what's really important is looking for the opportunities to introduce and discuss that diversity, even when the donor themselves or the models that you're using or the medical images that you have to examine don't necessarily beautifully depict particular minoritized identities and groupings, but where you can say, well, let's discuss the external laws of the cervix. Now let's discuss the assumptions that we've just made by saying this person was a mother. Let's explore that a little bit more. And so I think it's looking for those opportunities to bring the diversity in is maybe slightly easier. It would be lovely to have more diversity in terms of donation. I know that's something that at our recent ACE event was a big part of discussion is how do we support and ensure that people from minoritized groups feel that body donation for medical and for anatomical teaching is something that's open to them as well.
I think that's such a good point that I never really thought about it till I did my dissertation about ethnic inclusivity in anatomy, because all the cadavers that I prosectioned were light skin tones, and I never really considered, well, why aren't people donating their body? And there's a vast number of reasons for that. So, for example, religious reasons. People can't donate their bodies because of religious rituals they have around death and dying. And then when you say about other marginalised communities, historically and even current evidence suggests that people from marginalised backgrounds have worse experiences usually with healthcare professionals. We've seen it with maternal mortality rates for Black women are 5 times higher than of white women. We see it with LGBTQ plus individuals having, being discriminated against during their consultations. And we see it with disabled people too, where there's not being the correct accommodations or adjustments being made in, a doctor's office, where you would expect at the bare minimum, that is where inclusivity would be. And I think part of the way that we can encourage people to donate their bodies is by making healthcare a better, more inclusive space. Because if you have a bad experience with a doctor, you're not then going to want to donate your body for them to learn about the body on. You wouldn't, because you've had a bad experience with them. So I think it's about, and that'll take a long time, I think. And as society's views maybe on body donation and things change and awareness about it changes, hopefully we'll see that trickle through to the dissection room. But you're right, it's largely dependent on the population from which the bodies are coming from as well, and the people who are donating their bodies. But it would be nice, I suppose, to see that diversity. But I think now programs and things are getting more robust, so they do show different phenotypes and different identities and things. So I think it'd be interesting. We don't really have much representation, if at all, in our medical curriculum about intersex individuals. And with transgender people, they're part of our population. So I should know at least how to treat them at a baseline level. I'm not suggesting that every student becomes an expert in gender identity, prescriptions and things, but I think having that baseline knowledge is important because we do it for every other condition. I think we do need better inclusion in the curriculum generally.
And I think that's a really important point about that not everybody necessarily will go on to have a specialism that means that they're dealing with patients, for example, all the time, but acknowledging that trans people exist and they get ill from lots of different things, and that they will have medical interventions and interactions with medical professionals. So raising that awareness, I think, is really important of any minoritized group to remind the community that they exist. And to, sadly, more and more, we're maybe seeing that, particularly with information around trans individuals, there's misinformation. So incorporating it into curricula is really important as well.
Definitely. How has your research and the work that you've done impacted how you deliver the anatomical curriculum at the university? I know you've kind of spoken a bit about how you incorporate conversations about identity. Is there anything else that you've done with the curriculum?
Yeah, and so with this, I must acknowledge that I am really fortunate in the platform that I've given and the support that I get within the School of Anatomy at Bristol. Our head of school, Professor Michelle Spear, is excellent. She's very supportive of inclusivity and diversification ideas, and was very supportive of my kind of branching out into this sort of specialism, if you like, within anatomy education. I'm also the school education director for the School of Anatomy, which means that I have oversight and responsibility for the quality of the education within the school. So that's our medical anatomy teaching, dental, veterinary anatomy, and our science teaching. So there's an opportunity to actually influence the anatomy curriculum in a number of different ways. But it is really through work with colleagues, helping embed some of the principles and the practice into the teaching. In terms of kind of the initial steps and the first thing that I kind of did, particularly with sex and gender, was run teaching explicitly looking at sex, gender and anatomy. So in that we explore normal variation in anatomy. So, for example, looking at genital anatomy and how that varies, even within the cisgender population, so demonstrating and establishing the idea that there is not one physical body for the biological male and one physical body for the biological female, to use those terms that may be familiar for people. Explore that. We explore intersex experience, diversities of sexual development and how those kind of manifest in terms of the anatomy, but also spend some time to consider the challenging history that group have often had in terms of their interactions with the medical community, non-life preserving surgery. So that's an elegant way of phrasing that, but surgeries that are not essential for being life-saving, but that are altering the body in a way that the individual may later on have liked to have had an ability to consent to. And there's a lot of discussion around that in the intersex community about surgeries that are carried out on them as individuals when they're young. So we explore that a little bit. Then more broadly about the sort of the philosophy around gender and start to consider their gender and sexual minorities. And that's where we start to look at the trans community, for example, and the data that's out there on trans population, how many trans individuals are there in different regions of the world. The census data recently that was shared and published, we explore that a little bit and talk about what that means. But more importantly, we then go on to discuss the sort of the diversity within trans experiences. I'm not a member of the trans community. I'm not a member of the intersex community. So I'm very careful at these points to showcase and signpost students to members of those communities who can talk about their experiences more organically than I can. And we talk then about gender affirming care. And we don't just talk about it in the consideration of trans procedures, as they're often referred to in the media, but we talk about these procedures as how people, whether it's a surgical procedure, whether it's a pharmaceutical medication that's being taken, whether it is about gender expression, but how people affirm their care. We look then at actually to kind of throw a real kind of, call it a chaos grenade into the mix. We then start to discuss, okay, if sex is a biological construct and gender is a social construct, is there an argument to be made that actually sex is sex is a social construct? And that's where we start to explore some of the philosophers like Asta, who've kind of said, well, okay, yes, the data that we use in biology is biological, but the language that we use for biology is man-made or human-made. And therefore, that is subject to social influence. So that seminar is one that we run across our undergraduate programs. And then we also embed a number of those in our student research possibilities. So, for example, I offer dissertation projects annually to our applied anatomy and functional clinical anatomy students, either as the primary supervisor or as a secondary, where we look at anatomy and inclusivity, anatomy and sex and gender. So in a typical year, I would say I have something like 15 dissertation students, and a number of them are then working within this area. So this year I have 3 students that are specifically looking at sex, gender, 2 are looking very explicitly at gender affirming care, and 1 is looking at our conceptualization of the phallus. In terms of influencing things, I've been able to do subtle things like influencing session titles. In our school, we don't call lectures the male reproductive tract or the male reproductive system, or the female reproductive tract and the female reproductive system. Instead, we use more descriptive terms. So, we avoid it partly because it reinforces the binary, overlooks some valid and important lived experience in terms of sex and gender, but also because it focuses on reproduction and biological essentialism, as so much of our discussion of the female body does. We tend to see the female body represented in anatomy when we have to talk about reproduction. And so we try to avoid the term reproductive system entirely. We'll use reproductive and sexual system, genitourinary system, to mention the fact that the system is used for more than just reproduction. We tend to opt, as far as we can, for more descriptive lecture titles, things like penis, prostate, and testis, to show that that's what the topic of that lecture is, or uterus, cervix, vagina, for example. And that's a relatively subtle change to the curriculum, but it's one that I think is quite important in terms of accuracy. Another point that I would suggest is we've also got things like little disclaimers in early lectures. So the example I would use is when I give the first introductory lecture to the first year medical students on the genitourinary system, I typically have a brief mention at the beginning of this by saying that what we're going to discuss there are the most common combinations of genitourinary organs that they're going to encounter or that they're likely to encounter. And then I make a point of saying that that's not to say that other combinations don't exist, and that's not to say that other gender identities don't exist. While we're not considering them today, they will be considered later on, and that ties quite nicely into some of the work that Joe does within the medical school as well. But that is a subtle way, I think, of identifying that what you're going to discuss might be quite binary in its thinking, but that there's more to come. I have also been really fortunate that my work within this has been picked up. So in recent years, I have been invited to be a guest lecturer on a number of different courses at different UK higher education institutes, and invited as a keynote speaker to a number of conferences and events on the subject. And so that I'm really grateful for, because it means, in addition to being able to promote and encourage more inclusive sex and gender discussion in my home institute and across the courses that we run within the School of Anatomy, it also means I've been able to support and develop other colleagues and departments in sort of embedding similar approaches into their curricula and their delivery. And that I think for me is one of the really important goals, because for any of the change that I contribute to, I really want it to be sustainable, and I want it to extend beyond my practice, and it be something that influences others. And I think that's the main goal for most of us within the EDI sphere, is that we want to be able to help support others to pick up the baton and run with it in their own way, in their own institutes, so that the change is beyond kind of individual focal points of good practice.
Yeah, definitely. You said so many interesting things there. Definitely given me a lot of food for thought, and even my own descriptions of anatomy too. I really like that you used the term diversities of sexual development. I think was that the term you used. I really like that, and I think not just for sexual development, but just development, because I think we use quite negative when we use the term like anomalies, or you know, when we're talking about disability and things, because it's very demoralizing language, I think, and it's rather a diversity. When we are talking about disability and things and intersex individuals, it's usually in the context of it being something pathological and something being wrong with someone, when that's definitely not the case. It's just a diversity in human development. So I think that's a really nice way of putting it, and that's a really great change to make. Same with the urinary system, especially when you say about female sex as well, because even the etymology of the word vagina comes from the term sheath for a sword, basically. So it's just interesting to consider and separating that. And it's, as you say, how can we separate? Even though sex is supposed to be biological, you still cannot separate it from the societal views that we put on sex and on female bodies and all of that. So many interesting things. I'm going to have to get you to email me all your resources.
I often do share on social media my kind of my reading list, and because I've got a list of quite accessible, not all of them overly academic. Some of the philosophy can be a bit dense to get into, but a lot of it's very accessible that I recommend on the topic. On the example of the biological thing, the language, I think one of the ones that's a really nice example of this is the sperm and the egg. And there's a really nice paper, and the author escapes me, but I will share it so that you've got it to share with people. It really explores kind of the language around fertilization and the sperm and the egg, and how that's been kind of sold to us. And effectively it boils down to, and I'll put this in a slightly more flippant way, the fact that the way that we describe sperm is that they are these kind of intrepid explorers that are traversing this dangerous pathway and going on this adventure of a lifetime. And then we consider the egg to be this big, blancmange of a thing that just kind of passively gets bimbled and buffeted away, and something happens to it. And the more we study fertilization, the more we realize that that's not true, that the egg is a very active participant in that, and it's a really important participant in it. But when we think about where a lot of our understanding of fertilization initially came from, a lot of it is typically linked to, the Victorian era, where what were our expectations in society? They were for, women to be seen and not heard, and to be these passive things that things happened to, and that wasn't the expectation for the male. And so it's in little bits like that the societal influence and the social construction seeps into the biology. And then if you don't dissect it to that level, that assumption is just carried forward. And that's what I really love about exploring this topic, is every day is a school day. There's something else to unpick and be like, wow, the etymology of that word comes from really horrible meanings. And that's fascinating.
That's so, once blow my mind. Because you see the meme of like, oh, you're the sperm that won the race it's never from the perspective of the egg, is it? So
Yes,
no, that's
absolutely.
definitely changed my perspective on things. I'm going to go read up on that now. I'm going to be like writing an article about it. You're doing really amazing work at Bristol, and sounds like they're having
Thank
a
you.
really great curriculum there. So and you said you wanted to kind of change things on a more national scale as well. And was that kind of the process behind you developing ACE? And how did that kind of come about? And what are your plans with ACE going forward?
Um, yeah, I think it really was an awareness that there were pockets of really excellent things happening within activity and diversity within anatomy, and within the sciences in general. But that to really make a sustained and long term difference, that it would need to be something that sort of spread from that point. So I was really fortunate quite early in my invitations to guest lectures to get an invitation to deliver a seminar on sex and gender to the students in Hull York Medical School who were completing on one of the master's programmes in the Centre for Anatomical and Human Sciences. So I was invited by Dr. Lauren Clooney, who was the course lead for the course that had invited me to guest lecture. And after I delivered my lecture or my seminar to the group, Lauren and I went to sort of debrief and refuel, and that's when we started really kind of reflecting on the drive and the appetite for inclusivity within the community, within anatomy, but we also started reflecting on some of the barriers that we perceived to exist, and we thought that that included things like people maybe not knowing where to start, having a fear of getting things wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe people feeling that they weren't well informed on particular subjects. And so from that, really the idea of having some kind of safe space that helped support and share good practice and knowledge within the community kind of blossomed. So then from there, we got one of Lauren's colleagues, Dr. Kat Sanders, involved, also from the Centre for Anatomical and Human Sciences and Hull York Medical School. And the three of us kind of had those initial early conversations, and ACE, the Anatomy Collective for Equality, as a title was decided. So for the first little while, it really was just the three of us kind of planning and thinking up our first event, taking action. And that actually happened almost a year ago now. It happened at Easter time in 2023, and it was hosted in the School of Anatomy in Bristol. And we ran that deliberately as a bit of a hackathon. So the idea was that we gave a sort of provocation to the group that joined us, and we had about 30 participants from a number of different institutes in the UK, higher education institutes, so universities, but also some corporate organisations as well, some businesses that are involved in anatomy, that are stakeholders within anatomy as well, came along. And we basically challenged them as a group to think of tangible ways that we could make anatomy a more inclusive space. So it was quite a broad, open question. And we had a number of mini presentations from various members of the ACE community throughout the day, but just little short examples. And then we basically set people off with a number of different case studies to use as the fuel to kind of start them off, but to think about how they would adapt body donation, assessment, teaching, and research within anatomy to make it more inclusive. And we try to encourage people to, acknowledging that everybody was coming with the desire to make change, but not necessarily coming from a very established background in EDI. So we wanted to give everyone something that they could take away. So we started with a little bit of reflection on what the barriers are to being inclusive. Then we moved into sort of individual actions and powers that you could take away and say, I'm going to change my practice by doing this. Whether it is, I'm going to change, I'm going to add my pronouns to my email signature, whatever it might be, something that an individual could do. And then towards the end of the day, and admittedly probably the most challenging part of the day, was as partly because it had been a whole day of thinking about this, which was lovely, but, intense, was then thinking, how do we turn the changes into changes within the discipline more broadly? So how do we get organizations involved? How do we get stakeholders that are, from businesses and so on. How do we get them involved as well? And so that was our first event.
So what are your kind of plans for the future? I'll probably just say like what ACE is doing is really great. And I think it is so important to have a collaborative like that because everyone is stronger together, aren't they? They have more power. And when you have a group of individuals all calling for something, it's a bit easier to influence, like I said, those stakeholders, those businesses, those corporations to actually do something, develop and make a change. When it's just one person or a few people by themselves, it's much harder. But having that collective voice is so important and it's so nice to see. And it also shows that to students, there are people who want to do things and they want to work together. Because sometimes I think when people work in silos and they work by themselves, students aren't always aware of the changes that are being made or what you're working for behind the scenes. So then to students, they think, oh, well, no one's doing anything. When in reality, people are doing stuff. We just can't see what they're doing. So, yeah, I think it's great. So, yeah, what are your plans for the future with ACE? Where do you think ACE will go?
Thank you. No, it's lovely to hear positive feedback like that. I think so. I think at the heart of ACE is that community idea, that collective idea, and I think what we really want to do is kind of harness that. We were really fortunate that having some of the companies that were involved there, they were able to see the strength of feeling within the community, but also able to share their own desires in terms of inclusivity. And so really we want to build on that. Our next sort of steps really are to share some of the things that we found from that meeting. So our website is under construction to be a bit more all singing, all dancing than it currently is at the moment. It's a little bit more of a holding space because sadly for many of us, and as is typical with this work, often we're doing it in addition to all of the other things that we're doing.
Yeah.
So trying to encourage people to look after themselves, but also towards getting the website to capture a lot of that really nice data that we collected and that kind of shared understanding of what inclusive practice might mean for the subject. We're running a symposium at the International Federation of Association of Anatomists. It's a sort of a very large international conference for the anatomy community later this year, where we're going to share a little bit more. And then our intention really is to try and create a bit more of a tangible network for people to join so that there is that shared community within practice for people to realize that they don't have to be working in silos. It can be really isolating and you can often feel like you're working in isolation. So to kind of allow people to say, here's a space where I can go on and chat to other people that have the same desires and the same drive for inclusivity. We're also keen to try and replicate our event and have a few more. One of the big pieces of feedback, and it was really lovely feedback to receive, was from people who were not physically able to get to our in-person meeting last year, but who really wanted to be part of the conversation because there really is a strength of feeling and an appetite for this in anatomy. It's a really good time for us to be having these conversations. So we'd like to replicate that meeting online in a few different sort of setups so that we can try and really expand that voice as well. We have been partnering a little bit with some of those organisations I mentioned. So, for example, Primal Pictures has done a really great job of making a pledge in terms of their inclusive practice, not solely as a result of the ACE event, but I think the ACE event contributing to it, and they've stayed in contact with us to help get some discussions going in terms of that, and that's really great to see. So we'd like to be able to support other organisations that are stakeholders in anatomy and making their resources inclusive, because that's one of the big things that came out of our meeting was there's a huge appetite for inclusive resources. And I mean that in the sort of the widest sense of inclusive in terms of who they're representing, but also inclusive in terms of their practice for being made, sort of things like not using the labour of minoritized groups and not paying them effectively for it, and all of those kind of things. So it's the true 360 degrees side of inclusivity. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities. There's some great work within other organisations within anatomy as well. But I think formalising that opportunity for discussion and community and a shared vision of inclusive practice, I think are kind of main goals for the next little while with ACE.
I think you make a really good point. Most of the time when people are doing this work, they are doing it alongside all of that other responsibilities. The work we do with anatomy, I do it on the side of, being a student as well, and you're doing it on the side of your kind of teaching commitments and things. So that's why sometimes it can feel things might take a little bit longer, but it's still just as important to kind of keep going. And I think having that support from other people and everyone working together is really nice. And you can just ask, oh, I have a really good resource for this. Do you have anything similar? Because I suppose people also do work on different aspects of inclusivity that they might focus on. So some people, like yourself, might focus a lot on sex and gender. Someone might focus a lot more on race, ethnicity, someone else focusing on disability. And then you can all bring that work together and, have a chat, because no one's going to be an expert on everything, are they? There's so much inclusivity in itself. You could write books and books and books on everything. So it's just about sharing that information and being able to have that open, safe discussion, really.
Absolutely. And I think I couldn't agree more. I think the point with the experts is, and the expertise is really interesting, because I would say that while there's huge appetite in anatomy and there's a lot for us to be considering, some of this work is in its infancy, really, in terms of how much we're having to unpick and unpack. And so I think it's also acknowledging that to be involved, you don't have to be an expert in everything, as you say,
Yeah.
but you also don't necessarily need to be an expert on one particular area either, because for some of these changes to come into effect, all we need is willing and people to say, do you know what, I can make these straightforward changes, and that gets me something that's more inclusive in my delivery, but helps contribute to the wider conversation. Not everybody needs to be an expert in that particular field of EDI or in running and facilitating EDI discussions or EDI related discussions, because there is a specialist skill set there, and that sometimes can be a barrier. But to kind of reassure people that being willing and having time to sort of contribute and adopt, whether it is straightforward, easy, quick wins, or whether it's some of the more complicated stuff, that's all part of the movement for that more inclusive practice.
Yeah, definitely. I think that links nicely to my last question for you. So, what advice would you give to students interested in making more inclusive changes to the curriculum and being involved in that?
Reach out. I think it's probably the big one. We love it whenever anyone's trying to make change, change can be really difficult, and managing change can be really difficult. And so getting buy-in from people involved is really what it's all about. And so for students, if they're interested and they've identified something that they think needs to change, or they're not really sure what needs to change, but they know that they care passionately about a particular subject, then reaching out, I think, is a big part of it, because it helps with that, establishing that buy-in. There are always little things to be doing. So sometimes it's not necessarily about saying I'm going to dedicate all of my spare time to helping with this particular project. Sometimes it can be really little things. So, getting involved with those. I say that with a degree of hesitancy, because I also think that if people are giving their time, then acknowledging that most of us are doing this work as sort of volunteers and doing it as extra, I think also we need to acknowledge that time is a resource and it's valuable. And so any students that are giving their contributions to this, I think, know your value in it as well. So don't be taken advantage of. But I think it's great to have students involved, particularly students of minoritized entities, or from groups where they've classically been minoritized and overlooked. I would say that it's great to have that organic involvement, because one of the tensions that we always have with these kind of projects is elevating the subject, but not necessarily being seen as, for example, the cis man talking about trans identities. So actually, if you are a minoritized student who is part of a minoritized group, expressing interest is fabulous, and that involvement really helps with the organic consideration of that subject and that authenticity in the consideration of the subject. But again, I would say don't feel you have to be just because you're a member of that group. So I think it's really important that we also acknowledge that we're not putting that emotional labour on members of the community and the group. terms of if you're curious and it's not necessarily about getting active in the change, but you're curious about expanding your knowledge, I think curiosity is the big thing. I think I wish everybody was a little bit more organically curious about lived experience. So I would say reading is the big thing, and that's the same whether you're a student breaking into this subject or whether you're an academic. I think the more you read, particularly if that reading is from the voices of the community or places that you wouldn't necessarily associate. So a lot of my reading in recent years in this has been kind of what I describe as embracing the woolly. In biological and medical and clinical and anatomical sciences, we tend to focus on, air quotes, pure science, and we overlook the softer subjects. But actually, there's an awful lot to be gained from looking at philosophy. And that's where you start to draw out the nuance of social construction. If we're talking about it in terms of gender, that social construction process has a lot of overlap with the social model of disability, has a lot to overlap with our conceptualizations of race. So there's a lot of other identity groups that you can start to apply some of those principles to. So I would say that's another big area. The big thing that people can be doing is embracing the wider literature, not just the classically described, oh, you want to learn more about anatomy, here, read another anatomy textbook. Actually, a lot of the things that have kind of expanded and blown my mind in terms of understanding anatomy have been from reading books that are nothing to do with anatomy and saying, hold on, there's anatomy in that. Why are we not talking about it? A great example is I read a book recently all about the cultural significance of the anus. And the whole premise of that is that in society, we build our society around the phallus. And so we build buildings that look like phalluses, and we have monuments that look like phalluses. And that as a system is promoting, some people have phalluses in terms of penises and some people don't. So it's a divisive idea. And this entire book is from the philosophy of, what if we'd centered the anus instead, because we all have one? And it was just a really interesting perspective to take. And now I must admit, not that I necessarily change what I teach in terms of the rectum and the anus in a different way, but I do consider it a little bit differently when we're having our conversations, and then start to be more explicit in our understanding of it as a sex organ, even though we don't classically consider it a sex organ, and all of these kind of things. And I wouldn't have come to that realization and that kind of reconceptualization if it hadn't been looking at the woolier, in air quotes, literature, the kind of softer sciences.
You're so right about just books opening your mind to a different perspective. And like you say, it doesn't necessarily have to be like, oh, I've learned this thing and now I have to do X, Y, Z. It could just be, I've learned this thing and now I can consider things in a different way, and I can think about things in a different way. When I was doing one of my optional modules, I read about kind of like cognitive load theory and all of that sort of thing. And now that's completely changed my perspective. Whenever I'm doing any teaching for students, whenever I'm receiving teaching, I'm like, oh, that's not a very good PowerPoint, The layout's not quite right. And I've tried to do this more. It was one of my New Year's resolutions, like just reading again, because I think so many students, I think you made a good point about I think sometimes curiosity gets beaten out of us because we have so many things that we have to learn and have to remember that you don't have the time or the brain space to be curious because you've got to remember anything. But trying to get out of the habit of being like, and actually when you are reading things for enjoyment and just to know rather than to pass a test, I think you actually retain it more than you do for when you're trying to do something. So there's some really good points and really good advice. And just from a student perspective, I say always reach out to people, because the worst they'll say is no. Everyone's usually really nice to you. So don't be worried about reaching out to lecturers. I know it seems scary when you first do it, but now I'm just like emailing people left, right and centre.
I mean, we're all human and we're all really busy, and that's the reality. And I don't mean that to be like academics are very busy. I mean everybody in the world is really busy. And so for anyone to reach out and say, actually, can I help out in some way and take a little bit of that load, I think more often than not, people will bite your hand off at the opportunity. Absolutely, you don't get if you don't ask. So acknowledging that people are very busy, a polite email reminder when you don't get a response to chase, that polite. Oh, I don't know if you saw my offer of help. Here's another offer of help. Very much appreciated as someone who feels like he's constantly fighting through emails.
That's great. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and having a chat. You've given me so many more ideas. How can listeners get in touch with you if they have any questions or want to reach out to you.
Yeah, they're very welcome to. The easiest ways are probably through my social media. So I use, it's a little outdated now because it's my pre-married surname, but I use at S for Sierra, X for X-ray, PAT, Papa Alpha Tango, at SXPat as my handle across social media. I don't tend to use X/Twitter as much as I once did for academic stuff. It tends to be a little bit more now Instagram. The other social media handle that we use is for ACE, which is at Anatomy Equality. So either one of those is a way to catch me. And just because I can't not plug it, the School of Anatomy has its own Twitter and social media handles, X and social media handles, and that is at UOBRIS Anat, as in at University of Bristol Anatomy, but abbreviated, so at UOBRIS Anat. So any one of those social medias is the best way to get in contact.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and chatting with me this evening.
Thank you, and it's been a real pleasure. I appreciate it. I appreciate being invited. Any opportunity, I promise I am good fun at a dinner party, because any opportunity, I will give lengthy answers about sex and gender, but I promise it's not the only thing I talk about. But any opportunity to talk about it, and I'm very happy to.
Well, this is the perfect opportunity. So
that's it.